look, thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is going to be slightly challenging because I'm going to have to do both at the same time. The screen, I need to follow it here. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me today. Very interesting presentation preceding me, so the bar is set quite high, and it's a bit, you know, I hope I can meet that kind of standard. Yeah, okay, but it's a heck of a small, some of the graphs are small, so you're gonna have to look in here. Anyway, look, I mean, I've been asked to talk about a comparison between the IRA and Net Zero Industrial Act. Now, the Roundtable, which is a Brussels-based think tank, and we're based not far from here near Schumann, we do European and global climate change policy, probably about 75 European, 25 global climate change policy. We have a very complicated name, the Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. It wasn't because we wanted a complicated name, but we wanted to signal from the very beginning that we're looking for a sustainable transition. People call it a just transition, people call it many things. We call it a sustainable transition. Why we call it sustainable transition? Because from the guy that I learned my stuff from, which is the Secretary General of the Rio Conference in '92, you're gonna move on the same kind of axis between environment, economic, and social. And that's what our concern is. Now, when the CBAM was brought in, and the CBAM was brought into the discussion here, this was not a popular topic in Brussels. I mean, if you all remember, some of us, you may have participated, John, with some of our sessions. We used to do border carbon adjustment sessions in Brussels a few years back. And we were literally not booed, but certainly being told by senior people in European institutions, this is a crazy thing. Why are you doing this? You're just distracting people from discussion. Now, lo and behold, as you've seen, you know, the political agenda has changed, and the CBAM has come in. Now, as ERCST, we have a world-class team in CBAM. Some of you may have seen our papers. And we followed it from the very beginning. We thought it was a great idea in many ways, but the devil is in the details. And it didn't quite pan out as well as some of us may think. There are major pieces missing, such as the exports as well as others, but this is not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to try, yeah, no, I'm not pushing anything yet. This is the appetizer. The CBAM was introduced, the war to end all wars. The EU, at least in our estimation, thought, well, you know, with the game in town, EU ETS, no free allocation, let's do CBAM. What are they going to do about it? So, well, what they're going to do about it, they did the IRA. Now, the IRA was, as we will go through it, was kind of a very difficult birth, but it's becoming quite a big baby and quite a teenager and running very, very fast. So let's go through the comparison, if you want, the main features of the IRA and NZIA, because we look at the Net Zero Industrial Act as a response to the IRA. You know, the CBAM, IRA, Net Zero, and who knows what's going to follow after this, because these are all band-aids. In the end, none of these are solving the problem. None of these can solve the problem. The only time when you run the problem is you have an equal carbon price, which is not going to happen very soon, or when everybody's going to be doing the same, which is also not going to be very soon. So we're going to be stumbling from one thing to the other for the next few years. This may not be orthodoxy in Brussels, but I think this is reality. Now, there. So I'm going to have to synchronize this. So as I mentioned to you, this was the appetite. We sense that the Net Zero Industrial Act, which was, I mean, by all admission, introduced as a response to the IRA, is helping, is doing a few things, but it's, again, it is all work in progress, and we will continue to see developments if you are in the international competition of how to address carbon leakage, how to address competitiveness. This has been a preoccupation from the very beginning. It's not something new. So now if you look at the Net Zero Industrial Act, I think most of you are quite familiar with it, so this is why I'm using these more as an aide-memoire as opposed to going through it line by line, because again, I assume that most of you are somewhat familiar with it. But this was a proposal put forward in March 2023, awaiting committee decision in Parliament, expected somewhere in October. Now, there's got the net zero strategic technologies, which targets 40% of the annual deployment needs for strategic net zero technology manufacturing in the EU by 2030. There's a provisions on permits, 9 to 12 month maximum permitting time, preferential treatment in terms of permitting, finance, preferential treatment in terms of public procurement. So these are all features that are somewhat known to you. Now, there's also a provision on carbon capture and storage. Look, we are also spending an enormous amount of time on CCS. We believe, okay, I've been in the carbon markets for a long time, and removals is one of the fundamental parts of the Paris Agreement. When the Paris Agreement was, and I did negotiate the Paris Agreement, I'm not Al Gore, but I did mention I did negotiate Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and it was quite clear that removals were part of that. It was net global zero. I remind everybody there was a net zero at the global. It was not local at every hamlet in Europe. So we applaud the fact there is a focus, an increased focus from the Commission. After many years, there's an increased focus on CCS. We see DG Air, DG Klima. This is great, and we are part of that effort. We co-chair one of the working group. We think this is fantastic. In the case of what they have put together, the target for oil producer 50 megatons of CO2 by 2030, I think that, we believe that this is an incomplete act. It's basically addresses one part of the value chain. I'm not sure that I would put my money to invest in this myself if I had to, not because I don't believe in the technology, but I believe that there are a lot of other things that need to come together in order for this to happen. So just kind of mandating a supply side, possible, and you can go and pray, but I think it's a difficult one to just kind of convince people or make people invest on a supply side demand only. Now, the remaining gaps that we see in the Net Zero Industry Act is clarity and impact assessment. The NZIA lacks clarity on these decarbonization impacts and lacks an impact assessment. Funding instruments, the instruments are scattered, leading to inefficiency for business, which is a big statement to make, an easy statement to criticize. It's easy to criticize all the time. And then the full value integration, we look at, that requires a full chain approach considering upstream raw material and downstream demand. So these are all things that we see them as gaps. But again, I would also say that's an effort. It's an effort to, if you want, compete, even though we don't say necessarily that with the IRA, but we're competing with a very different ball game in a different field, because the EU is not the United States of America. The governance is very different. They've got a ability to do things at the federal level that simply we do not have the ability to do that in Europe. Now, here comes the IRA, and this is done something, some of you will know him, done in collaboration with a good friend of mine and somebody who's on the ERCST board, Michael Melling, who's a fellow and a board member, but also is a professor at MIT. The origins come from the Biden Climate Plan 2019 and the Build Back Better plan in 2020, that they were repeating attempts to pass this, but in the end it was put together in different pieces as opposed to one piece, because the one piece, Senator Manchin wouldn't go along with some of the stuff, and that ended up with the American Rescue Pack, and the Build Back Better failed in 2021. Now, the signature laws that retain features all the big back. I think that I should do this because okay, excuse me for a second. Of the Build Back Better plan. So first of all, you have the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs, you have the CHIPS Act of 22, and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Frankly, I'm not sure how well you follow this. I followed it, but not necessarily as my central point in following the debate. One morning, you just found out that the Americans kind of, in their very typical way, reach an agreement, and they passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, for something that is close to $1 trillion, that's a heck of a name, but that's beyond the point. Now, the estimates are very wide, and the reason why the estimates are very wide is because the way this is being structured is you've got either upfront or on delivery, mostly in terms of tax credits, and it can go for $392 billion from the Congressional Budget Office to Brookings of $902 billion, to Credit Suisse about 800, mobilizing 1.7 trillion. So these are numbers that are very large, but numbers that are not necessarily, anything else but projections. We will understand what the numbers are as we move on, and you see how much take on there is of this particular provisions in the by the IRA. Now the funding allocation, and I'm not going to go through this, but this shows you a little bit of how McKinsey, for instance, the National Public Utility Council and McKinsey is looking at this. If you look, I would look first and foremost on the bar chart on the right, because the tax incentives are quite a big chunk of it. Tax incentive, corporate tax incentive, followed by tax incentive to the consumers, their grants, loans, and federal operations. But by and large, quite the biggest chunk by far is that of tax incentives at the corporate level. So the structures are very different for what the Net Zero Industrial Act is doing, as well as other funding mechanisms in the EU. Now, if I look at the funding allocation and the Inflation Reduction Act, you will see different tax credits. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the clean electricity production, it's, the base credit, there's a base amount. The base amount is 3 cents per kilowatt hour for clean energy. But if you introduce wage and apprenticeship conditions, this thing goes up 5 times. And if you introduce domestic content requirements, another 10%, and location and energy communities, another 10%, then before you know it, it's quite a significant amount. The same thing will go with hydrogen. The same thing will happen with CO2. If you look at hydrogen, is 60 cents per kilogram, but you multiply by 5 if you include wage apprenticeship provisions. So these are all numbers. The way they structure it, obviously it is a job creation thing as well. It may be clean energy, but it's a very much a job creation thing. This is how they sold it, I guess, on a bipartisan basis. Now, if you look at the funding allocation, another way of looking at the funding allocation under the IRA, you see there is the graph on the left is production tax credits. The graph on the right is the investment tax credits, and you can see the labor bonus, how large it is. It's a significant amount, and that kind of the stability of this very much, if you want, in contrast to the line graph to the left, which shows kind of the typical historical incentives that were being given, and that cascades and has the ability, that's kind of dissipated, it's got to be renewed. So this is a bit of a different kettle of fish. Now, the environmental impact of the Inflation Act, I will go through this and show you the whole thing. it basically kind of makes it to the NDC of the United States by 2030. That's kind of, in principle, if you look at the scattergun approach, if you want, in the graph, and the spread within the graph, it will make it like the emissions to date, business as usual in red, and the Inflation Reduction Act will take you to the NDC in 2030, more or less. Now, another graph that may be interesting, and this is based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, is the impact of the Inflation Act on manufacturing construction spending in the US and Germany. And if you look at the graph on the left, the CHIPS and the IRA has triggered quite a investment spree in the US. It's enormously vertical line going straight up. I don't know how long it's going to stay, how long it can defy gravity, but for the moment it's sure as hell going up. If you look into Germany on the right, it's fairly flat going down. Now, if I were German, I would be somewhat worried about it. Another thing is another actual manufacturing investment by technology. If you look at this, and the graphs are in different colors, you see by and large batteries, quite a substantial increase in 2023, as well as zero-emission vehicles. So these are all things that you can see investment, actual manufacturing investment by technology in the US since the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, a very quick graph showing, maybe not so relevant, but showing some of the investment, storage, solar, wind, hydrogen, carbon management, quite spread, the West Coast, East Coast, Central, North, the Northern, if you're on the Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin area, a lot of it in Texas. In terms of hydrogen, again, I'm not going to go into this in detail because we got quite a few slides here, but I will leave that with you. But you're looking, we already discussed that, the investment tax credit for manufacturing projects, but then it's up to $3 US per kilogram because there are incentives based on, especially on job creation. In terms of carbon management, looking at the timeline in terms of carbon management, you know the IRC 45Q tax credit in 2018, but then the Inflation Reduction Act itself kind of brings in a lot of value. The Inflation Reduction Act adds to 60 ton utilized or EOR, 85 tons captured and stored, $180 for DAX. These are significant numbers that are just different level from what we would see in the EU right now. And some of the activities in the capture activity project map in the US shows a significant amount of activity in there. There's activity in the EU without any doubt as well. Now, what we see also in terms of carbon capture storage project by subsector, you obviously look, if you look at the blue and the green, the dark blue and the green lines, the post-IRA, the amount of investment in storage obviously has shot up quite significantly. And if you look at the direct air capture, it's also grown up quite significantly. These are two particular areas. We believe that direct air capture has a good future. Now, we understand the economics of it, and everything should be driven by economics. The regulator should be worried about other things, not about the economics of the investment. And similar graph showing this. Kind of the investment since August 22, the amount of investment in storage is quite significant. You look at on the right side, the dark blue slide. Now, the last one is something that I also wanted to say, Alain, because I've been reading in literature something that has concerned me quite a lot. And this is an audience as good as any that I can say that to. One of them, there apparently there's a couple of options that people, people that I have respect for are considering: unconditional subsidies, large-scale deployment of renewables, imports of energy-intensive products, which kind of is another way to say to relocate in energy-intensive industries, or a combination thereof. I mean, that's a point of view. But that's kind of a scary point of view, because I am, sorry, my father was an engineer, I'm an engineer. I don't believe that Europe can be prosperous without an industry. It's just kind of one of the firm beliefs that we have in ERCST, maybe old-fashioned, but this is who we are. Now, we have to remember that a lot of it is driven by energy cost. And the other thing that we have to remember is that the energy crisis predates geopolitical events. The energy crisis, the cost of gas is not something that it was triggered by that. It was aggravated, exacerbated enormously, but it predates that. But also, in saying that you have three choices, you have to remember that we have made choices regarding to energy sources. And traditionally, we had nukes, gas, coal, and renewable. And there was a balance between these, and we moved. Now, the moment you removed nukes and you remove coal, and gas shot up to the roof, I mean, no wonder the price is what it is. I mean, it's just mathematically, that's what it is. And I would challenge any system. I would challenge any system that can be resilient in such a in face of such a price shock. But when you say that you have three options, I would also say that speed and the tools that you use in reaching your 2050 targets are also options. They are political options. The people make choices, politicians make choices. If you talk about flexibility, there are hydrogen. If you look at flexibility in the use of removals, of international removals, these are things that should be considered. So I think that we should be very cautious about kind of even considering modulating our emissions based on industrial production. Is not something that we would like to entertain. Again, it may be a sobering thing, Alain, but that's what it is. Thank you very much for allowing me to present today.